Africa. Kalle udu si hai. Samaya do ipatla sabo pino. Zuha uike. Welcome to all our listeners. Welcome to the Ports, NSFAS, Equity Equivalent Schemes and the HH Landslide edition of Ubuntunomics podcast. With me is Sbu from Isakombe Assets. Hello Sbu, how are you doing this week?
Hi, Sia. I'm fine, thank you, man. How are you that side?
I'm very well, thank you. I can't complain. We've got a bumper week this week as we'll be looking at the SA Port Master Plan, the NSFAS funding window that just opened, the JP Morgan EEIP fund, and the Afghan crisis for the SA update. And in terms of the Africa regional update, we'll be discussing the Zambia 2021 general elections, the Ebola in Côte d'Ivoire, as well as the 41st SADC Summit. So let's get started. Our first story is plan to expand Durban Port. The Department of Public Enterprises has announced a master plan that seeks to look for a potential private investment of 100 billion rand, approximately $6.7 billion, into the port of Durban over the next 10 years. And this is part of a broader recovery, reconstruction and reform plan by the government, which is aimed at transforming Transnet. Firstly, they've gone for the establishment of the Transnet National Ports Authority, which we discussed a couple of weeks back, as an independent subsidiary that will be responsible for operating the South African ports. And their second tranche in terms of the reforms involves exploration of potential investment into both the port of Durban and the port of Ngqura in the Eastern Cape. Sbu, you had some points on this one and some review in terms of how well or how our ports are actually performing relative to global standards.
Yes, yeah. Right. Our ports desperately need investment because, frankly, there has been a grave mismanagement and disinvestment at SOE Transnet. This has led to our ports being ranked among the worst performing container ports in the world in last year's research in 2020. According to research compiled by the World Bank and IHS Markit, out of 351 sites, Durban is ranked last on an administrative basis, while Ngqura is bottom of the statistical chart and vice versa. This is embarrassing for a middle-income economy like ours. There really needs to be an improvement, especially in operations and just general performance. You'll remember that about a decade ago, Ngqura was designed as a state-of-the-art transshipment container terminal. The facility still hasn't reached its full capacity to date. Transnet believes that the terminal should be integrated into a global network of terminals. For that, they say they need to position it together with a partner. Now, there has been about 195 separate private partnership in infrastructure projects over the last decade, with a total investment of 38 billion US dollars. Now, between 2000 and 2009, Sub-Saharan Africa's share of the global investment in ports was just about 20%. It was the lowest in the regions. And its value in monetary terms was only $4 billion in a decade. Now, you juxtapose this with figures for China. Between just 2006 and 2009, China had the same amount, $4 billion in investment in just 3 years. Yeah. And in the latter part of last decade, our BRICS partners, also China, India, and Brazil, recorded the highest number of PPI investments in ports and terminals. Now, the partnering, this PPI sounds nice on the surface. It is what we need. However, it is the intricate details in or around ownership and privatization of profit sharing, of profit making operations that becomes a real stickler. Because you will remember that the maritime and port industry has been subjected to increased financialization with financial institutions like banks and pension funds and wealth funds entering the market and providing large capital pools which were unavailable to the industry beforehand. So the port terminal sector is an attractive asset class, having the potential for huge revenue generation. For an example, container terminal operators are typically they financially outperform even container shipping lines, which are also strongly asset-based. So I think a couple of episodes ago, we touched on this subject regarding the unbalanced nature of subcontracting practices and how PPPs benefit private partners at the expense of public sector landlords. I mean, even now, the Port Authority will just be a landlord, and it will get partners who will come in and do all these and rake in all the profits. I think we discussed this when we had an episode on SAA or Access here.
Yeah. In fact, we were discussing it linked to the partial privatization of Transnet, which I then made the example of SAA and how that was gutted. And basically, all the revenue generating parts of the machinery of airport management and the services that SAA used to provide have then been outsourced and privatized in terms of baggage handling on the airport, which is the main income revenue generating segment of the aviation value chain, as opposed to tickets for bums on seats in terms of the passenger airlines. As you say, the devil will be in the details, and the government has, though, promised that Transnet will remain the owner of the infrastructure in terms of physical assets, but I'm not sure what they mean by that in terms of this attraction of additional investment. So will they own all, including the new assets which will be generated, or will these be owned by the private operators who will then be subcontracted by the Transnet National Ports Authority, the TNPA? So yeah, the devil is definitely in the details, and also clearly what we're seeing is cutting off a little bit of the fat for the private sector here. Clearly this deal to me is quite similar to something we'll discuss later in terms of the JP Morgan EEIP fund that they've just gotten approved by the Department of Trade and Industry. But let's move on to our next story from South Africa this week. The NSFAS funding window has been reopened. The National Student Financial Aid Scheme NSFAS board has decided to grant a once-off application window period for all the unfunded 2021 registered students who are eligible for NSFAS funding in all the universities. The application window lasts for 2 weeks from the 18th of August and will close on the 3rd of September. Smoo, you had a point about where this decision actually comes from.
Outstanding debt at South African universities is close to 14 billion rand as it stands. This is mainly from the missing middle, which those students whose households make between 350,000 and 600,000 per annum. You'll remember that this student debt phenomenon is global. Now, the additional 2021 budget allocation, which caters for the unfunded yet registered students, must have come in as a result of protests and campus shutdowns in March this year. You will remember how a bystander who had nothing to do with student protests, his name was Mr. Mtokozis Ntumba, how he died in Bramfontein due to callous police action. Now, following the protest, Minister of Higher Education, Innovation and Technology, Dr. Blaine Nzimande, announced a reallocation of the DHET budget as approved by Cabinet. Now, an additional 6.3 billion was meant to be allocated for NSFAS, what we're talking about. Now, all departments have faced budget shortfalls because of the government austerity program. Now, and as an example, now National Treasury, their budget review projected a cumulative consumer price increase of 13% for this year, 2021 up to 2023-24. However, NSFAS was set to increase from 34.8 billion to 36.8 billion in 2023-24, resulting in a cumulative increase in nominal terms of 4.6% in the same medium-term period. So you must make a comparison. Consumer price index is 13%, whereas budget increases will be 4.6%. So that's where the problem lies. And now, to me, it looks like we'll still be having the same protests and campus shutdowns year in and year out because of these budget shortfalls.
Sure. So your point is that, incomes are definitely shrinking in real terms, whilst at the same time the budget increase in order to help fund or support those families is increasing at a much slower pace.
Precisely.
I think, we're going to have to keep an eye on that, and definitely not the best time to disrupt higher education or education generally, given the fact that we've already lost so much of the year due to the pandemic and so much uncertainty and just the general disruption of the system as a whole, that we really can't afford any further disruptions in addition to what we're already dealing with in terms of the pandemic. And of course, this, in fact, as we record the show today, government has approved the vaccination of all South Africans above 18. And I think this is also another crucial milestone in our response to the COVID-19 pandemic. But, some might critique and say, at this point when a lot of basic education institutions, high schools, are shutting down as a result of rising infections, maybe government should have expanded that to include also those who are in high school, or at least for some of the matrics who are at the most crucial stage in terms of their education program. But yeah, that's
yes, you make that's a valid point. That's
a discussion for another day, though. All right, moving on to our next story, and JP Morgan opens an EEIP fund. The Department of Trade, Industry and Competition, the DTIC, has approved the JP Morgan Equity Equivalent Investment Program EEIP fund, which consists of the Abadali Fund, a Black Business Growth Fund, and the Abadali Grant. The initial commitment of $340 million from JP Morgan, which is equivalent to $22.8 million, will provide $300 million through the fund and $40 million through the grants. And the EIPP program itself was introduced by the DTIC to allow multinational companies that have global practices preventing them from complying with the ownership element of BBBEE through the traditional sale of shares to Black South Africans to apply for the approval of an EEIP, which qualifies for ownership points on their scorecard. An EEIP is a program or a scheme that's designed to fulfill the requirements of the BBBEE ownership requirements, and may also entail a program targeting investment or any other program that promotes socioeconomic advancement or development within the South African economy. Smoo, you had a number of points on this one. Let's get started.
My initial remark was, wow, how it is just amazing. Is this how much it costs to buy your way out of a country's developmental objectives? This is only $23 million. It is a drop in the ocean considering the profits JP Morgan stands to make. I mean, out of all that facilitation, their financing and their administrative costs, they're going to be raking in billions. Anyway, at a fundamental level, I ask myself, why are we still talking about triple BEE or any other derivative of a shareholder scheme? I mean, this has failed to transform our economic landscape. I mean, today BEE is almost like a swear word. Anyhow,
Yeah.
what what is so difficult with parting with some equity to black shareholders for these multinational companies? They do the same in China, where they come in as minority partners. The only time a foreign company got away with diluting their equity structure when they invested in China. The only company that I know of is Telsa. Now, the reason for that was that China was being strategic because of technological gains they needed to make. China is poised to be a global leader in EVs. I mean, in fact, 50% of EVs are already manufactured in China. So anyway, coming back to South Africa, these guys are talking about economic and social impact. They're talking about addressing critical funding gaps for small and medium enterprises that do not meet traditional underwriting. They're talking about funding and mentoring support at early stages of business undertakings. They talking about targeting industrial and green economy sectors. They're talking about jobs for young people and deeper levels of industrialization. It all sounds very nice. It shows that they've done their research and they've done their homework and they know that we are desperate. So they're dangling this juicy carrot in front of us. Yet what they're offering is not equity. It is not risk mitigation for startups who need an investor who is equally at risk should that investment go south. So my view here is that MMEs in South Africa need a lender of last resort. If a foreign investor or a financier wants to start something before they want to come in, they shouldn't stand aloof, at least in exchange for our sovereignty, which is cheap, by the way, in South Africa. They should be offering. I mean, what JP Morgan is offering are just debt instruments. They're no different to.
We cannot even consider this as equity. I mean, 300 million out of the 340 is going to loans, and these are profitable loans. Doesn't matter whether you're concessional rates or the point is the guys are making a return on this, and for them, this $22 million is a pittance. It's just a rounding error, really, and it's quite sad. So, from my point of view, the policy firstly is not properly, being applied. The EEIP program is only supposed to allow those corporates who aren't already involved in some kind of shareholder scheme elsewhere on the planet. So if JP Morgan is already doing this in China, then there's no reason for our government to actually allow them, because the idea is that this is supposed to only apply to multinationals whose policies do not allow them to do shareholder schemes or to provide sale of shares to local indigenous partners, so to speak, which is the policy that you've described in China. Secondly, I'm not certain why we want multinational firms to be competitors to local firms in terms of public procurement. My point of view is that there's no reason why JP Morgan would be doing this out of the goodness of their heart. If they were, they wouldn't need to get the program approved by government in order to get some scoring on their scorecards. So that tells me that for them, the BEE scorecard is quite important. They need to get the points, and this is helping them in a competitive edge for bidding for public, public contracts basically. And my view is that we should be using public procurement to transform the economy. So it's almost as if this policy itself is shooting the BE policy as a whole in the foot, because clearly local firms cannot compete against multinational firms. And if you're not going to use your public procurement to enable transformation in a country and an economy unbalanced like ours, and at the same time facilitate competition from multinationals by it's absurd. But obviously this is not the first own goal that the DTIC has made. And earlier on this week, when we were publishing stories from our last episode, one of my former colleagues at National Treasury was thanking us for posting on Kenya because she was writing a brief for the minister on Kenya. So I don't want to criticize our colleagues at DTIC much, but they really need to do their homework. If JP Morgan is already operating in China and they have similar policy requirements, why are we doing this? And then also, why do we have a policy that is allowing multinational firms to compete against local firms for public procurement? It's absurd. We fight this at every level. In terms of our engagements at the WTO, in terms of global sourcing requirements, which the EU has been trying to force South Africa to negotiate in their favor for, which we reject because we want to use public procurement for transformation. So for me, it's quite a controversy, actually. It's funny and ironic, though, that when this story was being reported in the media, it was being reported as though the DTIC as well as JP Morgan were partnering up for a new fund that was going to help businesses recover from the recent plundering during the riots and the protests. So, yeah, it's a lot of smoke and mirrors, but ultimately this is bad policy making.
Exactly. I mean, all they did was just give JP Morgan a shortcut. They've just, yeah. Anyhow.
And that's a chapter in the annual sustainability report.
Exactly.
Top of the pops. Moving on, Spoo, to our last story from the SA update this week. Concerns over the Afghan crisis. The South African government has taken note of the unfolding situation in Afghanistan and has raised concerns by the plight of the thousands of displaced Afghans seeking safety and security amid the deepening crisis. Government has called on the authority on power, in other words, Taliban, to ensure the rule of law, human rights and safety of all Afghans and foreign nationals alike. And the Department of International Relations and Cooperation, DIRCO, has established via the South African High Commission in Islamabad, Pakistan, that they're in contact with a number of South African nationals based in Afghanistan to ensure their safety and provide the necessary consular assistance. So it seems as though DIRCO is working through the Pakistan High Commission in order to evacuate some of those South Africans stranded in Afghanistan. Smooth, you had another point about this one. And I think you raise a very crucial point.
Yeah, anyway, for starters, I like their description there when they say it's an authority in power. That is the Taliban. Yes. Yeah. Anyway, I know some of these things are quite confusing. I mean, they're talking about the rule of law. Whose law? Whose interpretation?
Precisely, and this is precisely the problem in this, right? That there's this extreme interpretation of Sharia Islamic law, which the Taliban has historically enforced. And issuing a statement for them to enforce the rule of law is not going to help resolve the crisis.
Yeah, I mean, Afghanistan is a foreign country where they are a foreign people with their own culture, their own worldview. I mean, I think we should be careful not to take sides in this affair. Let the people of Afghanistan chart their own future. I'm not saying we should not be concerned with how they treat women and children. No, that's not what I'm saying. I am, however, saying that we should accord them the same courtesy we give to Saudi Arabia or we give to Iran.
Sure.
Not jump on the Western bandwagon. Our country never comments on whether the Saudis allow women to drive or not. So our non-aligned philosophy should guide us even with this new authority in power in capital in inverted commas. So now, as a country, I wonder how we are to respond should the US ask South Africa to accommodate refugees fleeing from Taliban, because the US have asked Uganda to receive 2,000 refugees, as an example. So I mean, we should not be acting naive. That's what I'm getting at. We should think ahead, because what we're dealing with here are geopolitical considerations and areas of influence. I mean, China is on the one side and the US is on the one other side. We have to choose. I don't know, Sia.
I think we're in the lukewarm war now, pun intended. So, but jokes aside, this is an international crisis. A calamity, in other words, because with the vacuum that's created now, with the rushed exit of the US, obviously, and what has already been seen is the Taliban taking over, that Afghanistan is actually going to become that place where, and this is the big fear, that terrorism is going to be reestablished, and they will be supporting networks throughout the whole globe, and we can't leave it open. But at the same time, I do support the notion of allowing the people to self-determine, because ultimately it's not an external party that's going to resolve the political crisis there. It's either the neighbors or it's going to be the people from Afghanistan themselves. Yes, we should be providing refuge for those who want to leave, but ultimately there is no solution which excludes the Taliban, so to speak, as we've seen. And I think the US was trying to go and show its power and sort of eliminate the problem of Taliban, which they haven't, clearly, since they've taken over the whole country. And at the same time, the only thing that they've been able to do is to so-called bring bin Laden to book. And again, they've actually left the situation a little bit worse than what it was, with this vacuum that they've created. And my concern is that if you link this Middle Eastern crisis with Afghanistan to what we're already seeing in the Horn of Africa and the Sahel region, in terms of the rising presence of the Islamic State and the rising fundamentalism that we've seen in West Africa, we are really aligning a whole band of, a belt that will become the future playground of what I call the lukewarm war, as we see China come in on the one side and the US on the other. And if you look at the whole region throughout, these are the two powers which also have presence. In Djibouti, where the US and China both have military bases, and all along the Sahel region, which they are already involved, and as far down as Central Africa in the case of China in the UN mission in the DRC. So I'm very concerned that we're now taking this conflict and war against terrorism into a new theater, which is going to involve Africa. And that's really one of my biggest concerns out of this whole catastrophe.
And South Africa needs to make their stand. I don't know. I don't know whether we should pick a side or not. In fact, I'm confused, really.
I think South Africa really can't. I don't think that we can be innocent bystanders in this, particularly given the Southern African connection to this whole picture I'm trying to paint with the existence of Cabo Delgado. Of course, the recent updates, which we'll deal with in the SADC story on the Africa Regional Update, is that the Rwandan army led alongside the SADC deployed force in Cabo Delgado, and has been able to take control of Praia Macambo, which is one of the key ports in the Cabo Delgado province. And they've been traveling north, taking up more and more parts of the contested areas in Cabo Delgado. But they've done so without having to shoot or release a single bullet, which means to me, A, the insurgents are either hidden amongst the refugees, or wherever they've hidden, they're hidden, but doesn't mean that they've been resolved. The conflict has not been resolved. We've not dealt with the other party, and all we've done is just been able to scare them away until such a point which they're willing to come out again. And so for me, with that presence in SADC region, so close to South Africa, we cannot be innocent bystanders. And I just hope we make the right decision and we're caught on the right side in terms of how this whole process unfolds.
Exactly.
And at the same time, I fear and hope that we don't see as many African states involved in proxy wars, which are ultimately a result of the so-called lukewarm war that I'm trying to paint between China and the US. On that note, it brings an end to the SA update for this week. And that brings us to the Africa Regional Update for this week. Our first story in the Africa Regional Update is the Zambia 2021 general elections. Zambia held their general elections to elect the office bearers for the presidency, members of parliament, and local government. The Southern African Development Community didn't take a physical deployment of election observers this time. Instead, they've gone with a virtual deployment, which involves consultations with key electoral stakeholders, in line with the revised SADC principles and guidelines governing democratic elections, which were revised this year. The chairperson of the SADC organ on politics, defense, and security, Dr. Mokgweetsi Eric Kiabetswe Masisi, issued a statement congratulating Zambia on holding peaceful elections, notwithstanding reports of isolated and sporadic acts of violence. According to the final results released by the Electoral Commission of Zambia, former President Edgar Lungu Chagwa lost to President-elect Mr. Hakainde Hichilema, the leader of the United Party for National Development, UAPND, who won 57.9% of the votes from a 69% voter turnout. Meanwhile, Lungu received 37.2% of the votes in what is seemingly an HH landslide. Sbu, you had a few points together in terms of how HH was able to achieve his landslide.
Yeah, whichever way one looks at this one, it is a resounding defeat with telling repercussions, not only for the country, but for the region as well. And this, especially when one considers that UNIP, the Liberation Party of dear departed Kenneth Kaunda, had thrown in there a lot with the former President Edgar Lungu. Now, the youthful character of the current voter is also another factor, because according to UNICEF, 53% of Zambia's population is below the age of 18 years. This demographic is also evident in other SADC countries. It is reported that young activists used social media to canvass for and rally around the call for change. Now, this could explain the reason why the government temporarily shut down platforms like WhatsApp and Facebook. Plus, there was a half blackout of the internet. We should also not neglect to point out there were also other factors, economic factors, like the rising cost of living in Zambia, consumer price inflation, or inflation on basics, on things like food and veggies, and then there was the kwacha, who got devalued by 40%. Then added to this is that country's foreign debt crisis. It resulted in less spending on public goods and services. You know, when Zambia took out these loans, they took them out for social spending. They built things like hospitals and schools and roads, but all of this was financed in foreign currency. Now, I don't know what the new administration will do to deal with the prevailing fiscal conditions, since the party, the UPND, that won the election, is also said to be neoliberal in their philosophy. We always talk about our fears concerning Africa's debt crisis and debt issued in foreign currency in our podcast. I mean, most African countries are heavily indebted. Anyway, how do you read this considering the political and economic developments?
Sure. Look, I think it's quite comparable to what we had at, when was it? I think the resignation of former President Jacob Zuma and President Cyril Ramaphosa took over. What some have called the Ramaphoria and what some have called, the cleanup and CR17 campaigners are definitely would be in the latter group. It seems as though economically, though, the country is poised for an economic recovery that even without much effort from Hichilema, conditions will improve. One, for example, is that on the back of the announcements by automotive companies to discontinue production of the internal combustion engine, hence moving towards EVs or electric vehicles, the price of copper has shot up, and there's been quite a strong rally on the price of copper, such that the economic recovery could be enabled because of the better macroeconomic conditions, which obviously Zambia will benefit from as a country that relies for about 60% of its exports from copper. And obviously, that bodes well for the Kwacha in terms of their access to foreign exchange reserves improving and the pressure to depreciate the currency slowing down. And, without much effort. And obviously, if Hichilema follows through with his promises, some of which I think are quite positive. I've recently seen a tweet of his on the situation at ZESCO, which is a major binding constraint in the country, given that it affects the ability of industry to operate due to the blackouts, and the economy generally depends on electricity supply. So his view is that, and for a while, ZESCO has also been in financial disrepute, with the management proposing an increase in electricity tariffs in order to make, financial recovery. But his view is that there also needs to be a cleanup in order to reduce corruption, reduce wastage, etc., and improve the efficiency of ZESCO as a whole. And I think for me, that was one of the key interventions which were not really being prioritized by ZESCO, which I thought were critical in ensuring that things improve at ZESCO. So I think we'll have to watch and see. On that note, let's move on to our next story from the Africa Regional Update. Côte d'Ivoire has its first Ebola case in 25 years. The Ivorian Ministry of Health has confirmed a case of Ebola virus for the first time since 1994. The virus was found in samples collected from a patient who was hospitalized in Abidjan after arriving from Guinea. Guinea recently experienced a 4-month-long Ebola outbreak, which was declared over on the 19th of June 2021. And the vaccination of high-risk populations against Ebola began on Monday in Côte d'Ivoire, and the swift response came after 2,000 vaccine doses from Guinea were deployed using the ring strategy, where people who have been in contact with the confirmed Ebola patient are given the vaccine, as well as the first responders and health workers. The outbreak in Côte d'Ivoire is the third this year after the DRC and Guinea. Sbu, you had a quick point and a question on this one.
This outbreak is a clear indication that the continent urgently needs to implement its plans around our efforts or our objectives to develop vaccines within the continent. I must, however, say that Africa does seem to have handled these Ebola outbreaks efficiently. Through learning and locally developed solutions. Don't you think?
Yeah, I definitely agree with you. And I think with the establishment of local labs for testing and quick response in order to ensure that we deal with the mutations of the virus and from a genome point of view, that has put us in a good footing in terms of our response to these outbreaks. I couldn't agree with you. And on that note, let's move on to our next story. ECOWAS customs training. The Economic Community of West African States, ECOWAS Commission, in collaboration with the African Union Development Agency, the AUDA NEPAD, commenced training of border officials as part of operationalizing the Nigeria-Cameroon Multinational Highway and Transport Facilitation Program. The training was held at the Transcorp Hotel in Abuja, Nigeria. Also featured the establishment of the ECOWAS Joint Management Committee for the border post, which is going to be co-chaired by ministries in charge of transport of the two partner states. The training ended with an emphasis on continuous training of border officials to ensure better understanding of the joint border post concept. I think that's another positive story coming out of ECOWAS in their process towards improving regional integration.
Yes, yeah.
On that note, that brings us to our last story on the Africa Update, the 41st Ordinary SADC Summit. The Southern African Development Community SADC held its 41st Ordinary Summit of Heads of State and Government on the 18th of August in Lilongwe, Malawi. The summit elected His Excellency Dr. Lazarus Marcus Chakwera, the President of Malawi, as the chairperson, and His Excellency Felix Antoine Tshisekedi Chilombo, who is the President of the DRC, as the incoming chairperson. SADC also elected His Excellency Matamela Cyril Ramaphosa, President of South Africa, as the chairperson of the Organ on Politics, Defense and Security Cooperation, and His Excellency Dr. Haig Geingob, President of Namibia, as the incoming chairperson. The summit also noted updates on the security situation in Cabo Delgado province in Mozambique and commended member states for pledging personnel and providing financial support towards the deployment of the SADC standby force in Mozambique. Summit also commended Tanzania for offering to host the Regional Counterterrorism Center, which will offer dedicated and strategic advisory services on terrorism threats. Summit approved the appointment of Mr. Elias Mpedi Makhosi, a Botswana national, as the new Executive Secretary of SADC. Sbu, you had a point around how it's a positive development now that countries are cooperating further and actually putting resources in ensuring that regional agenda and regional security is being achieved.
Sia, what comes out as positive is this whole emphasis about cooperation and support. Now with intergovernmental structures like NATO, which deal with matters of security, it is not only about the deployment of soldiers, but what is more vital is funding too. I am reminded of how a former President Donald Trump, his administration threatened to pull out of NATO due to the disproportionate funding the US had to shoulder.
And that brings us to the end of our Africa Regional Update this week. And that takes us to the numbers game. And the number for this week is 170 million rand. Can you guess what that number is?
170 million rand. It's not too big a number and it's not too small a number. And so No, I can't guess this time around. A building. No, I don't know. A road or something.
So you think it's a construction of some physical asset, infrastructure, a building or a road?
A building or a road, yes. Yeah.
No, that's not the answer. All right. So what we're actually faced with is 170 million paid out in Marikana reparations.
Oh, yes.
So since August 2018, the South African government has paid out at least 170 million rand in damages to families of those who lost their loved ones and who were injured during the 2012 Marikana massacre. Government has been negotiating with and compensating families through 5 legal representatives for claims for loss of support, emotional shock and suffering, unlawful arrest and detentions, personal injuries, and malicious prosecution. Government is also facing a lawsuit for additional constitutional damages, which are difficult to quantify, but the initial offer of 18 million rand was rejected by the Socio-Economic Rights Institute of South Africa, SERI. There are still 38 claimants with pending settlements, 37 who are represented by Katla attorneys and 11 by Nkome attorneys. Government has reached settlement and paid out 4 million rand to families represented by the Wits Law Clinic, 69 million rand to those represented by SERI, and 97 million to 253 families represented by Nkome attorneys. And that brings an end to our show this week.
Thank you.